Welcome, Joy friends, to Once Upon a Storybook. My name is Cynthia with Cynthia's Joyful Creations, and today we're going to look at another story from the book In the Arms of Angels by Joan Wester Anderson. Today's story is titled Beyond Coincidence. We should get to know the angels now if we wish to spend eternity with them. And this came from Pope Pius XII. Research shows that the elderly have mystical experiences almost as frequently as children. How nice to know that even when we aren't there to care for those special relatives and friends, the angels know what to do. Paul and Mona Barclay of Schaumburg, Illinois, had a deep affection for Cardinal Joseph Bernardin. They had been impressed with his humility when he was appointed to lead the archdiocese and introduced himself to Chicagoans as Joseph, your brother. Years later, when it appeared he was losing his battle with pancreatic cancer, they were inspired by his acceptance of God's will. When the cardinal died on November 14, 1996, church officials planned a funeral mass at Holy Name Cathedral, followed by a slow procession through Chicago's north side and west side to Mount Carmel Cemetery in Hillside. The Barclays wanted to pay their respects, but attending the funeral mass was not an option. Most of the seats would be reserved for dignitaries or important folks. In addition, Paul has a condition called peripheral neuropathy. I hope I said that right. And needed a cane for walking support. Today he uses a wheelchair. But the Barclays were familiar with Mount Carmel Cemetery because 2 generations of Paul's family were buried there, including a cousin, Archbishop William D. O'Brien. They decided to watch the Mass on television that day, then drive to Mount Carmel, park somewhere nearby, and watch Cardinal Bernardin's procession pass. It was a practical plan. What we didn't count on was how long it would take the procession to arrive, Paul says. Thousands of people flooded the route through the city, and vehicles in the line drove at a crawl. By the time the cortege had reached the cemetery, it was almost dark, and there was a large crowd of mourners waiting at the gate. Since I was not too good at walking with my cane on uneven lawns, we decided we would not go inside the cemetery to the Cardinal's mausoleum that day, Paul said. We'd visit it another time while at the family gravesite. They went home, glad to have been just a small part of that Memorial Day. Since the mausoleum was closed to the public during the winter, the Barclays' next opportunity to visit came one day in April of 1997. The building sits atop the highest hill at Mount Carmel and is an attractive classic structure with stained glass windows and a domed roof with a statue of the Archangel Gabriel at the top holding his trumpet. All of Chicago's cardinals and bishops going back to the early days of the archdiocese are buried there. The only entrance is a long series of stone steps leading up to the front door. We never gave much thought to getting up there, Paul says. Mona was there to help me, and we got to the top without a problem. There were several visitors milling around inside, and gradually the activity died down. And when the Barclays found themselves alone with the sun almost setting, they decided it was time to go. They went out the door and faced that long stone stairway. It seemed to be steeper now, Paul thought, and there was no handrail for him to hold to steady himself. Why hadn't he noticed before? Even with Mona's assistance, he knew he couldn't possibly get down safely. He said a quick prayer asking for help, but a handrail did not miraculously appear. The two looked at each other. Maybe if I sit and inch down one step at a time, he suggested to Mona. She was doubtful. It would be hard on Paul's back and bottom. What if he tumbled forward? What else could they do? Suddenly, unbelievably, a young man stood at Paul's right side. Here, he reached for Paul. You look like you could use some help. Paul and Mona stared astonished. Where had he come from? No one had been coming up the stairs, nor had anyone else been in the mausoleum. But here, as out of thin air, was this genial young man putting his arm around Paul to steady him. Paul felt the strength of his arm. "You must be a guardian angel," he said, only half in jest. The young man smiled and gently guided Paul's first step. Mona followed, perplexed. This helper was well dressed, obviously not a workman or a groundskeeper, but how had he known they needed help? "I don't remember the details," Paul says. "I felt completely confident as I was in good hands, and it seemed as if we got down those stairs in record time, almost gliding." They had parked in the circular driveway at the bottom of the stairs, and theirs was the only car. The young man led Paul to the car and let go of him. Paul looked up to express his gratitude, but their gracious assistance was gone. He had disappeared as silently as he had come. Mona and Paul stood stunned. Had this been a dream? Paul was safely at his car, and there was no explanation either could give. If Mona had not witnessed this, I would have thought it was my imagination, Paul says. But hadn't he asked God for help there on the stairs? And wouldn't the same God who cared for Paul all his life be listening now? Franny Camden had worked as a grocery store checkout person in Odessa, Texas for more than 16 years while raising 3 sons and becoming a grandmother. Then in 1995, her store closed. The manager of another store in Odessa asked some of us to come there, and we did. But the working conditions were terrible, so my son talked me into moving to Nashville, Tennessee to start over again. It was a bittersweet request since her son was having some marital problems and had no family anywhere in Tennessee. Franny thought the idea had possibilities. I don't think there's a mother alive who wouldn't want to be with her child when he's hurting. But there was a lot going on in her life. A sister was ill and might need her. Being unemployed had created financial difficulties, and it was the middle of winter. Not a good time to move anywhere. To make matters worse, her car was old with a non-functioning defroster, and she doubted it would make the trip. But Franny has always been close to the Lord, and she knows His will, and she knows He will take care of her, even her smallest need. I love to testify of God's miracles, His mercy and grace, and His angels too. She asked her Bible study group at Temple Baptist Church to pray about it with her, and the group discerned that she should go to Nashville, at least for a while. "Well, we have to obey the Lord," Franny says. She found a place to live in Nashville, and her son came and towed her old car there. He was extremely grateful to have his mom nearby. Franny had been in Nashville about a week when there was an ice storm in the area. Around dinner time, Franny's daughter-in-law, Pam, phoned to ask if Franny could pick her up from work. "I don't know the area very well," Franny protested, looking out the window at the car sliding along. "How would I find you?" "Well, you have to watch carefully for a little sign that says Training Center," Pam told her. "It's not a very big marker, and it's the only one. When you see it, turn into that driveway, and I'll be out in front of the building." Franny was doubtful as she grabbed her coat and hurried to her car. It was getting dark, and the icy rain was starting to freeze. How could she drive in this weather with no defroster? And the rush hour traffic was terrible. Franny gripped the steering wheel and tried to stay out of everyone's way. The drive seemed endless, and it took a little while before she realized that she was farther along than she should be. She had missed the sign. Dismayed, Franny turned around and drove back a few miles, and then took the same route once more. I could hardly see out the window. Cars were skidding and honking, and I was so scared. Nor could she find any sign. Again she realized that she had probably driven right past it. What was she going to do? How could she find this tiny marker in the midst of rain and traffic? I hunted for that sign, but it was nowhere. I kept praying and crying out to the Lord to help me, and about the 4th or 5th time I passed the same intersection, I saw something ahead that was different. As she approached, she realized that it was a sign. An enormous metal sign, at least 5 feet by 5 feet, painted a vivid green, as all the major highway signs are, But this sign did not give route or highway directions. Instead, huge letters spelled the words Training Center, and a giant arrow pointed to the now obvious driveway. It was her sign, the one she'd been looking for. No one could have missed it, but this sign was not tiny as Pam had described it, and Franny had driven this stretch of road several times that night. She had gone right past this driveway. There had been no sign there before. Franny brought her daughter-in-law safely home that night. She eventually settled into Nashville and supported her son through a difficult 2 years. Eventually, the young couple did break up, and the time seemed right for her to return to Odessa, where she now is a grocery clerk again. Life is usually good, but when it isn't, Franny can think back to that very special night in the rain when she saw the huge green sign as a guidepost from the angels. How does Franny know it came from heaven? Because her job in Nashville took her past that driveway every day thereafter, and the only sign she ever saw there was the small one Pam had described. God made a big old sign just for me, just for that night, Franny says, and he sent the angels to put it up. When Anthony Thomas Garano was born, no one was happier than his grandpa, Tom Vallambrasso. In Italy, where Tom was born, custom dictates that the first grandson is special and carries parts of his grandfather's name. The Garano and Vallambrasso families lived in Estonia, Connecticut, but tradition ran deep. Sadly, Tom could only imagine what this little package of joy looked like. He had lost his sight at 56 to retina pigmentosa and cataracts, but he needn't have worried. The bond between the two was instant. Baby Tony had several health problems and was in and out of hospitals during those first few years. My dad was the only one I could talk to about the medical issues, says Judy Garano, Tony's mom. The rest of the family was too scared to listen, but Dad always did, asking very good questions, even suggesting some to ask the doctors. Perhaps because of his own difficulties, Tom was extra sensitive to Tony's. By the time Tony was 3, he and Grandpa regularly watched together Wheel of Fortune, Jeopardy, and the news. Tony loved to snuggle with Dad in their favorite chair during these shows, says Judy. Tony would describe what he was seeing so that Dad could feel like he was seeing it too. After school, the bus would drop Tony off at Grandpa's house while they waited for me to come home from work. This went on for years. As Tony's 9th birthday approached, Tom began to ask a special favor from God. He said nothing to anyone about it, but with the help of some family members, he purchased a special toy for his grandson, a big, noisy police car that Tony had been wanting. During that time, Tom's wife also took him to ophthalmologist for a routine checkup. The doctor dilated Tom's eyes as always to check how his disease was progressing, then left Tom and his wife Norma alone as the drops took effect. Norma was reading a magazine when Tom asked, "Norma, does the clock on the wall say 3 p.m.? Norma looked up. "Yes, but how did you know that?" "I don't know how to explain it," Tom told her, "but I can see." Norma shouted for the doctor, who had no explanation. Perhaps it was the drops. He decided to keep Tom on them for a while and see what happened. When Tom and Norma returned home, still in a state of shock, the first person to greet them was Tony. "Nice shirt, Tony," Grandpa said. "But how come you have that long tail of hair in the back?" "It's just a fad, Grandpa," Tony told him. "But who told you about it?" Grandpa turned to Judy. "Now you need a touch-up," he said, laughing. Judy's skin started to tingle. It was true. Her roots were showing. Tony looked at Tom's big grin. "Grandpa," he shouted, "you can see!" It was mid-October, and Tom became reacquainted with the world during the weeks leading up to Tony's 9th birthday. Everything seemed new again, each day a gift. On that special afternoon, Tom watched with glee as Tony blew out his birthday candles and opened his very special gift, the police car from Grandpa. It was the best day either of them had ever had. The next day, however, brought consternation with it. Once again, Tom's sight was gone, and once again no one knew why. Tony was very upset. He had brought Tom a picture he had taken, and Tom had to admit he couldn't see it. Why had this happened to the man he loved so much? But Tom, as always, had the explanation. "Several months ago I asked God for something special," he told his grandson as they cuddled together in their favorite chair. "I asked him if he would let me see you just once in my life, maybe on the day when you turned 9 years old." "You did?" Tony asked, wiping away tears. "Yes," Tom nodded. "I wanted to see you open that special gift. And God didn't just give me one day. He sent angels to lend me their eyes so I could see you all month. Instead of being sad about that, Tony, we should be happy." Tony understood. Every day he thanked Dad's angels for their gift, Judy says. He continued to share his life with Dad and snuggled even closer while they watched TV together. Tom would never attend another party for Tony. He died 5 months later. But his family knows he's watching over them now, with the eyes that only heaven can provide. Gloria Manning grew up in Pocono Mountains in Pennsylvania and was an outdoor girl from the moment she learned to walk. Even after she raised a family, became a widow, and finally became a senior citizen, she still walked. This was fortunate because she now lived in an apartment complex in Willow Grove, Pennsylvania, mainly rented by younger people who were gone all day. There was no one there to give her a ride. Until her retirement at age 74, Gloria walked to and from work, a distance of about 3/4 of a mile each way. It was just part of her routine. After work on a beautiful fall day, Gloria gathered her purse and belongings, waved goodbye to her coworkers, and started the trek home. "The road has no sidewalk," she says, "and as I passed a corner, a car came around it very fast. Trying to get out of the way, Gloria hopped on the grass and dislodged a stone. Tripping over it, she lost her balance and fell face down onto the concrete street. Pain evaded her face. Her glasses fell off and her dentures broke. Part of them jammed into the roof of her mouth, and the car zoomed by. Gloria lay on the street, bruised, bleeding, and dazed. Her slacks were torn at the knees. Blood from her mouth dripped onto the cement. What was she going to do? She had a distance yet to go. Could she make it in this condition? Shakily, she attempted to get to a kneeling position. Just then she heard another vehicle approach. Not again. The driver wouldn't see her there and would run over her. Gloria was about to scream when the vehicle pulled alongside her and stopped. It was a rickety truck, and a man was getting out of it carrying a roll of paper towels. How unusual! Gloria looked up at him and caught her breath. To me, he looked just like Jesus, with long hair and a quiet calmness about him. In a moment he was at her side, handing her some towels for her bleeding mouth and nose. Without saying a word, he picked up my glasses and purse and helped me into his truck. With a lurch, the wobbly vehicle started up. Gloria closed her eyes for a moment. Was she safe here? She thought of the man's beautiful face and somehow knew she had nothing to fear. How had he seen her lying there on the side of the road? It was a miracle that he hadn't driven over her. Gloria's apartment complex was ahead just a few blocks, but before she had time to direct him, the man turned in at the gate, as if he had driven the route 1,000 times. He went up one street, turned at another, and finally stopped in front of Gloria's building. With the engine still running, the man came over to Gloria's side, opened the door, lifted her down, and carried her to her front hall, and handed her purse to her. "Can you get up your steps okay?" he asked. It was the first time he had spoken. Gloria's mouth was still bleeding, so all she could do was nod. Turning away, she painfully climbed her stairs, listening for the sound of the truck rattling away. The sound never came. By the time Gloria had reached the welcome safety of her apartment and her front window, the truck had disappeared. Gloria went straight to the kitchen sink. "I don't know how I did it, because I have a condition that makes me faint at the sight of blood. But I pulled the broken dentures from the roof of my mouth, then I put ice cubes in my mouth and phoned my daughter." Luckily, 2 weeks before, Gloria had been fitted for new dentures. They were ready the very next day, and although Gloria needed to heal before wearing them, she was able to go back to work when the time came. But first, as she quieted from the shock, she thought about her experience, and the more she thought about it, the stranger it seemed. For one thing, the man had never asked Gloria where she lived, and her apartment was not the easiest place to find. For another, although the truck was quite loud, she never heard it leave. The fact that he looked like depictions of Jesus I've seen, and he came immediately, he had paper towels in his truck, I am convinced he was an angel sent to me by God. I was so sorry, there was no way to thank him. But she thinks he knows. Well, thank you for listening to these little tiny excerpts of angel stories under the topic of Beyond Coincidence. I hope you enjoyed all of them today, and I look forward to meeting with you again next Tuesday as we look at yet another angel story. And until then, my friends, be joyful, stay happy, stay safe, and I will see you again for the next angel story. Bye.